February 16, 1944. The Pacific Ocean. 35,700 yards. That is exactly 20.3 miles of open water. At that distance, a battleship appears smaller than a grain of rice held at arm's length. Actually, that is not accurate. At that distance, a battleship does not appear at all. The Earth itself curves away, hiding everything beyond the horizon, like a secret the ocean refuses to tell. The Japanese destroyer Naval was running for her life that morning, her engines screaming at maximum speed, her crew confident in one absolute truth. No gun in human history had ever hit a moving target from beyond the visible horizon. Physics said it was impossible. Mathematics said it was impossible. Every naval officer trained at every academy in the world said it was impossible. Then 8 shells weighing 700 pounds each came screaming down from the empty sky. They straddled the Naval perfectly, shells on both sides, shells fore and aft. A textbook perfect straddle on the first salvo. The Japanese lookouts, using the finest optical equipment ever manufactured, had seen nothing. No enemy ship, no muzzle flash, just sudden death falling from beyond the curve of the planet. That single moment changed naval warfare forever. But this is not a story about battleships or shells or radar screens. This is a story about a handful of engineers and technicians who spent years being told their idea was insane, their calculations were wrong, and their dreams were science fiction. This is the story of how ordinary men made the impossible ordinary. To understand what happened that morning off Truk Atoll, we need to go back to a time when Japan was winning the war. December 1941 through August 1942 was a nightmare for the Allied forces in the Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Navy seemed unstoppable. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island. One disaster followed another. American ships were being hunted and destroyed with terrifying efficiency, especially at night. The Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, became the worst naval defeat in American history. Japanese cruisers appeared out of the darkness like ghosts. In less than 60 minutes, they sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers and killed over 1,000 sailors. The Americans had radar. They detected the Japanese force approaching. But having radar and knowing how to use radar were two completely different things. The Japanese had something else. They had the finest optical equipment in the world. Their binoculars used massive 21-centimeter objective lenses that gathered light like nothing else afloat. Their lookouts trained for years to see in darkness, to spot the subtle difference between black water and a black ship against black sky. They developed special filters that enhanced starlight and moonlight. They practiced night combat until it became instinct. The Imperial Japanese Navy built their entire strategy around one simple idea. They would never match American industrial production, but they could match and exceed American skill. They would whittle down the American fleet through superior night fighting, through better optics, through training that bordered on obsessive. And it worked. From Savo Island through Guadalcanal, Japanese ships dominated the night. American crews feared darkness the way ancient sailors feared sea monsters. Something had to change. But what? You cannot train eyes to see beyond the horizon. You cannot build binoculars that defeat the curvature of the Earth. You cannot wish physics into submission, unless you stop relying on eyes altogether. The man who changed everything was not an admiral or a famous scientist. He was an engineer named Hannibal Ford, a quiet, methodical man who ran a small company called Ford Instrument Company in Long Island City, New York. Ford was not a Navy man. He was an inventor who became obsessed with mechanical computation. In the 1920s, he built calculating machines for the Navy that could solve gunnery problems automatically. These machines used gears and cams and rotating drums to perform calculus to predict where a moving target would be in the future based on its current position and speed. The Navy called these devices fire control computers, though they contained no electronics at all. They were purely mechanical, and they were incredibly precise. But Ford knew his machines had a fundamental limitation. They could only work with data from optical rangefinders. If an operator could not see the target, the computer was useless. Then radar arrived. In the late 1930s, British and American engineers developed systems that could detect ships and aircraft by bouncing radio waves off them. Early radar was crude. It could tell you something was out there somewhere, approximately in that direction. Maybe at this distance, give or take a few hundred yards. Good enough for warning, useless for shooting. Ford looked at radar and saw something nobody else saw. He saw the future. He understood that radar would get better. The wavelengths would get shorter. The antennas would get more precise. The range measurements would become more accurate. And when that happened, radar would provide better data than any optical system. Not just equivalent data. Better data. Radar could see through fog. Radar could see through smoke. Radar could see through darkness. Radar could see over the horizon. Ford began designing a new generation of fire control computers that would accept radar input directly. His colleagues thought he was crazy. Radar was a detection tool. It was not a precision instrument. It flickered and jumped and faded. How could you base a firing solution on electronic noise? Ford ignored them. He worked on the problem for years, solving challenges that seemed insurmountable. How do you track a target that appears and disappears on the screen? How do you filter out interference? How do you account for the delay between when a radar pulse goes out and when it returns? Most importantly, how do you build a machine that can predict where a moving target will be 40 seconds in the future when your shells finally arrive after traveling 17 miles through the air? Ford solved each problem one by one. His computers grew more sophisticated. They incorporated gyroscopes that sensed the ship's roll and pitch. They calculated automatically for wind speed, air temperature, barometric pressure, and even the rotation of the Earth. They accounted for barrel wear, adjusting the firing solution based on how many rounds each gun had already fired. By 1942, Ford Instrument Company was building the Mark 37 fire control system, the most advanced gunnery computer in the world. But the real breakthrough came when they integrated it with a new radar called the Mark 8. This radar operated on a wavelength of just 10 centimeters, short enough to measure range, with an accuracy of plus or minus 25 yards at distances exceeding 40,000 yards. That is 25 yards accuracy at 22 miles. For context, Japanese optical rangefinders at the same distance would have an error of several hundred yards at minimum, assuming they could see the target at all, which they could not. The system was installed on the Iowa-class battleships as they commissioned in 1943. USS Iowa joined the fleet in February. USS New Jersey followed in May. These ships were unlike anything that had ever sailed. They displaced 57,000 tons fully loaded. They measured 887 feet long. They could exceed 33 knots, making them faster than most cruisers. And their 9 16-inch guns, connected to Ford's fire control computers and fed by Mark 8 radar, could reach out and touch targets that existed only as electronic blips on a screen. The Japanese had no equivalent. They had nothing even close. Their fire control systems still depended on optical rangefinders that could not see beyond 15 nautical miles at best. Their computers, where they existed, were generations behind. They were fighting with swords while the Americans were building rifles. Nobody knew it yet. The first real test came off Truk Atoll on February 16, 1944. Task Force 58 had launched a massive carrier strike against the Japanese base. As aircraft pounded targets ashore, Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered his surface ships to sweep the atoll's perimeter and intercept any vessels trying to escape. USS New Jersey was part of that sweep. Her radar operators were scanning the ocean when they detected a contact running northeast at high speed, range 37,500 yards, 500. Target classification destroyer. The contact was identified as Nowaki, a Yagumo-class destroyer fleeing the destruction at Truk. Commander Edward Carroll Thomas. The officer in charge of main battery fire control studied the data flowing into his plotting room. The target was beyond visual range, beyond optical range, beyond any range that any battleship had ever successfully engaged a surface target. He ordered the main battery to train on the radar contact. In Turret 1 and Turret 2, massive hydraulic systems whined as the 16-inch guns elevated toward maximum. Each gun barrel weighed over 267,000 pounds. Each shell weighed 2,700 pounds and required 330 pounds of smokeless powder to launch it. At 0843, the firing keys closed. 8 guns fired simultaneously. The sound was beyond description. The battleship heeled visibly from the recoil. 8 projectiles accelerated to 2,500 feet per second in a fraction of a second, then began their long climb into the morning sky. They rose nearly 3 miles into the air at the apex of their trajectory. They fell for 42 seconds before they reached the ocean. And they straddled the Milwaukee perfectly on the very first salvo. Aboard the Japanese destroyer, nobody understood what was happening. Lookouts using those magnificent 21-centimeter binoculars had seen nothing on the horizon. The rangefinders showed no targets. The ocean appeared empty in every direction. Then, massive columns of water erupted around the ship shells, falling from the sky like the wrath of an invisible god. The captain ordered emergency maneuvers. Milwaukee heeled hard, her engines straining for every possible knot of speed. A rain squall provided temporary cover, scattering the American radar signal just long enough for the destroyer to change course radically. More salvos followed. More shells fell, each pattern tight and accurate, each volley proving that this was no lucky accident. Milwaukee escaped damaged but afloat, her crew shaken to their core. They had witnessed something impossible. They had survived something that should not exist. Word spread through Japanese naval channels within days. Reports arrived describing shells falling from beyond the horizon with impossible accuracy. Intelligence officers interviewed Milwaukee's crew when she reached port. The accounts were consistent and terrifying. The Americans had developed fire control that did not require eyes. The Americans could hit targets they could not see. Everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about naval warfare was suddenly obsolete. But this was only the beginning. The engagement off Truk proved the technology worked in combat conditions against a real moving target. It proved that radar fire control could achieve results that optical systems could never match. It set a record for the longest range straddle in naval history. A record that still stands today because the age of the big gun ended before anyone could try to break it. Yet one destroyer escaping in a rain squall was not the same as winning a war. The question remained: could this technology work at scale? Could it work in darkness? Could it work against an enemy fleet that was determined to close range and use the night fighting skills they had spent decades perfecting? In Part 2, we will see the answer. We will witness the Battle of Surigao Strait, where American battleships equipped with radar fire control would face Japanese battleships in the last surface engagement between dreadnoughts in human history. The Japanese came with optical rangefinders and superior training, and the courage of men who knew they were sailing to their deaths. The Americans came with electronics and computers and the cold mathematical certainty that they could kill what they could not see. What happened in those dark waters would prove once and for all that the age of the samurai lookout was over. The age of the machine had begun. In Part 1, we witnessed the impossible. USS New Jersey straddled a Japanese destroyer at 35,700 yards a distance, so great that the target existed only as an electronic blip on a radar screen. The shells fell from beyond the horizon, from beyond the curvature of the Earth itself. The Japanese lookouts, using the finest optical equipment ever manufactured, never saw the battleship that nearly killed them. That single engagement proved that radar fire control worked. But proving technology works in one engagement is not the same as changing how an entire navy fights. The U.S. Navy in 1944 was a massive institution with traditions stretching back over a century. Admirals who had spent their entire careers trusting their eyes were now being told to trust machines instead. Many of them refused. The resistance was not stupidity, it was experience. These men had seen new technologies fail catastrophically in combat. They had watched sailors die because someone trusted an untested system. They had learned through blood that in war, the proven method beats the promising method every single time. And now, with the largest naval campaign in history approaching, everything was about to change. Because the Japanese were coming, and they were bringing their battleships. The problem with radar fire control was not technical. By mid-1944, the Mark 8 radar and Mark 37 fire control system had proven themselves repeatedly. The problem was institutional. The United States Navy had spent decades developing doctrine around optical fire control. Gunnery schools taught officers to use rangefinders and statometers. Training manuals described procedures for visual spotting and range estimation. Promotions went to officers who excelled at traditional gunnery techniques. An entire generation of naval leadership had built their careers on skills that were suddenly becoming obsolete. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the Third Fleet, was a surface warfare traditionalist who believed in aggressive action and trusted leadership over technology. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, commanding the Seventh Fleet, had similar views shaped by years of conventional naval thinking. Neither man was ignorant or incompetent. Both were proven combat leaders. But both approached radar with the same skepticism that cavalry officers once approached machine guns. It works in demonstrations. Will it work when men are dying? The debates in planning sessions grew heated. Younger officers who had trained with radar systems argued for their adoption. Senior officers demanded proof that went beyond statistics. One admiral reportedly asked how he was supposed to trust a system that could not tell him the color of the enemy's flag. Another complained that radar operators could not distinguish between a battleship and a large merchantman at extreme range. These objections were not entirely wrong. Early radar did have limitations. It could be fooled by weather. It could be jammed. It required trained operators who understood its quirks. But the objections missed a larger truth. Optical fire control had its own limitations, and those limitations were far more severe. You cannot see through fog with binoculars. You cannot see through smoke. You cannot see through darkness. You cannot see over the horizon, no matter how good your lenses are. The Japanese had exploited these limitations ruthlessly throughout the war. Every night battle from Savo Island onward had demonstrated that Japanese optical superiority translated directly into American casualties. Something had to change. But changing naval doctrine in the middle of a war required more than good arguments. It required proof that no one could ignore. That proof came from an unexpected source. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf was not a radar enthusiast. He was a practical officer who had commanded cruisers and battleships in multiple engagements. He had seen American ships destroyed by Japanese forces that appeared out of darkness. He had watched sailors burn and drown because American radar operators did not know how to use their equipment effectively. But Oldendorf was also a man who learned from failure. After each engagement, he analyzed what went wrong. He interviewed survivors. He studied Japanese tactics. And he reached a conclusion that separated him from many of his peers. The problem was not radar technology. The problem was radar training. American ships had radar. American crews did not know how to fight with radar. Oldendorf began running exercises with his battleship division, forcing his crews to track targets and compute firing solutions using only radar data with optical systems deliberately disabled. The results were initially terrible. Operators struggled to maintain consistent tracks. Fire control computers produced wild solutions. Shells fell hundreds of yards from their intended targets. But Oldendorf persisted. He ran the exercises again and again. He identified the best radar operators and had them train others. He developed procedures for integrating radar data into fire control that accounted for the technology's limitations while exploiting its strengths. Slowly, performance improved. Range errors dropped from hundreds of yards to dozens. Track consistency improved. Crews learned to trust what the radar told them, even when their eyes saw nothing. By October 1944, Oldendorf believed his ships were ready to fight a radar-controlled battle. He would get his chance sooner than anyone expected. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the largest naval engagement in history. The Japanese combined fleet sortied with nearly every operational warship in a desperate attempt to destroy the American invasion force landing in the Philippines. The Japanese plan was complex and risky. A northern force would act as bait, drawing away the powerful American carrier groups. While American carriers chased this decoy, two surface forces would converge on the invasion beaches from different directions. The southern force, commanded by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, included the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso. These were old ships built during World War I, modernized between the wars, but still formidable. Their 14-inch guns could devastate transport ships and landing craft. Their mission was to transit Surigao Strait at night and fall upon the American invasion fleet at dawn. Oldendorf was given command of the force assigned to stop them. He had 6 battleships, all of them survivors of Pearl Harbor, repaired and returned to service with updated fire control systems. He had 8 cruisers and 28 destroyers. He had PT boats for scouting and torpedo attacks, and he had a plan that would use every advantage radar provided. Oldendorf positioned his force across the northern mouth of Surigao Strait in the classic naval formation known as crossing the T. His battleships would form a line perpendicular to the Japanese approach. As the enemy advanced up the strait, they would be able to fire only their forward guns, while American ships could fire full broadsides. It was a textbook ambush. The geography was perfect. The tactics were sound. But the key to everything was radar. Oldendorf knew the Japanese would come at night. They always came at night. Japanese doctrine emphasized night combat because Japanese optical systems gave them advantages in darkness. But this time, darkness would not help them. American radar would see them coming from over 20 miles away. American fire control would track them continuously. American guns would find them in the blackness. The night of October 24th to 25th, 1944, was dark and moonless. PT boats stationed at the southern entrance to Surigao Strait detected Nishimura's force approaching around 22:30. They reported contact and launched torpedo attacks that caused confusion but scored no hits. The Japanese pressed on. Destroyer squadrons waited further up the strait. As the Japanese battleships advanced, American destroyers launched torpedo attacks from both flanks. The attacks were devastating. The battleship Fuso was hit by at least 2 torpedoes. She began to list heavily, eventually breaking in 2 both halves, continuing to burn and drift separately through the night. Destroyers Yamagumo Michishio and Asagumo were sunk or crippled. But Yamashiro pressed forward. Vice Admiral Nishimura, despite losing half his force, continued toward the American battle line. Perhaps he hoped to inflict some damage before dying. Perhaps he simply had no other options. Perhaps he did not fully understand how badly his force had been hurt. Whatever his reasoning, Yamashiro steamed north toward Oldendorf's waiting guns. At 0351, the cruiser USS Louisville detected Yamashiro on radar at a range of approximately 32,000 yards. The contact was clear and steady. Fire control computers began tracking, calculating range-bearing, course, and speed. The data fed automatically to the main battery directors. At 0353, Admiral Oldendorf gave the order. Open fire. USS West Virginia fired first. Her Mark 8 fire control radar had acquired Yamashiro at over 44,000 yards and tracked her continuously as she approached. Now at 22,800 yards, the firing solution was precise. 16 16-inch guns elevated. The fire control computer made final calculations. The salvo buzzer sounded. 8 shells roared into the darkness. They were followed immediately by salvos from Tennessee and California. Then Maryland and Mississippi joined. The American battleships fired in careful sequence, each ship's fire control team tracking the fall of shot and adjusting their aim. Yamashiro never had a chance. The Japanese battleship was firing back her crew, attempting to use optical rangefinders in darkness against enemies they could not see. Japanese shells fell wild hundreds of yards from American ships. American shells fell close. Then they fell on target. Yamashiro was hit repeatedly within the first minutes of the engagement. Fires broke out across her superstructure. Her speed dropped as shells penetrated her engineering spaces. She began to list as flooding spread. At 0409, just 16 minutes after the battle line opened fire, Yamashiro capsized and sank, taking Vice Admiral Nishimura and most of her crew with her. The second section of the Japanese Southern Force following behind under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima arrived to find wreckage and burning oil. Shima wisely reversed course and retreated. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over. It had lasted less than 3 hours from first contact to final withdrawal. Japanese losses included 2 battleships, 3 destroyers, and approximately 10,000 sailors killed. American losses were 39 men killed aboard 1 destroyer that was hit by friendly fire in the confusion. The kill ratio was staggering. The implications were absolute. The news spread through the fleet within hours. American battleships had annihilated a Japanese surface force in a night engagement. The Japanese had come with their finest optical equipment, their legendary night fighting training, their decades of doctrine built around seeing in darkness. None of it mattered. They might as well have been blind. American radar had seen them from beyond the horizon. American fire control had tracked them through the night. American guns had destroyed them before they could effectively return fire. Surigao Strait was the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. It was a fitting end. The battle demonstrated conclusively that the age of optical fire control was over. No amount of training could overcome the advantage of seeing through electronics. Japanese officers captured later in the war spoke of the psychological impact. They had trained their entire careers in techniques that had become worthless overnight. They had mastered skills that no longer mattered. One officer compared it to spending years perfecting sword fighting only to face an enemy with rifles. The skill was real, the training was genuine, but the fundamental nature of warfare had changed. Within weeks, every operational American warship was running radar fire control drills. The skeptics who had demanded proof now had proof written in Japanese blood across the waters of Surigao Strait. Training programs were revised. New procedures were implemented. The institutional resistance that had slowed adoption collapsed in the face of undeniable results. But victory at Surigao Strait created new problems. The Japanese had lost their surface fleet, but they had not lost their will to fight. In the weeks following Leyte Gulf, a new threat emerged that would test American defenses in ways no one had anticipated. Japanese aircraft began appearing in formations that made no attempt to evade or survive. They came in fast and straight, aimed directly at American ships. They were not trying to drop bombs and escape. They were trying to crash into their targets. The kamikaze had arrived, and radar fire control, so devastating against ships, now faced a completely different challenge. Could the same technology that destroyed battleships at 20 miles stop aircraft at 200 yards? Could computers that tracked slow-moving surface targets keep up with diving planes? Could the men who had mastered one type of warfare adapt fast enough to survive another? The answer would determine whether American ships reached Japan or sank in the waters between. In Part 3, we will see how the same engineers who built the Mark 37 fire control system faced the kamikaze threat. We will watch as new technologies were rushed from laboratory to combat in weeks instead of years. We will learn how ordinary sailors became the last line of defense against pilots who had already decided to die. The battle for sea control had been won. The battle for survival was just beginning. In Part 1, we watched shells fall from beyond the horizon, striking a Japanese destroyer that never saw the battleship firing at her. In Part 2, we witnessed the Battle of Surigao Strait, where American battleships annihilated a Japanese surface force in the last dreadnought engagement in history. Radar fire control had proven itself against ships. The age of optical superiority was over. The Japanese surface fleet was broken. But the Japanese military was not defeated. They had watched their finest warships burn and sink. They had seen their legendary night fighting skills become worthless against enemies who could see through electronics. They understood that conventional tactics could no longer work against American technology. So they chose a different path. They chose to become the weapon itself. In October 1944, the first organized kamikaze attacks began. Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into American ships. They were not trying to survive. They were not trying to escape. They were trying to die in the most destructive way possible. And suddenly, the same radar fire control systems that had devastated battleships at 20 miles faced a completely different problem. How do you stop a man who has already decided to die? The kamikaze threat emerged with terrifying speed. On October 25, 1944, the same day as the Battle of Surigao Strait, the escort carrier USS St. Lo became the first major warship sunk by a deliberate suicide attack. A Japanese Zero fighter carrying a 250-kilogram bomb dove through anti-aircraft fire and crashed into the flight deck. The bomb penetrated deep into the ship before exploding. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar deck. St. Lo sank in less than 30 minutes, taking 143 men with her. Within weeks, kamikaze attacks became a daily occurrence. Japanese commanders had discovered something profound. A conventional attack required the pilot to survive long enough to drop his bomb and escape. This meant approaching at specific angles, maintaining certain altitudes, executing careful maneuvers. All of these requirements gave American gunners time to track and destroy the aircraft. A kamikaze attack had no such requirements. The pilot only needed to reach the ship. He could come from any angle. He could dive at maximum speed. He did not need to pull up or escape. Every second of his approach was dedicated to one purpose: impact. American fire control systems, designed to track ships moving at 30 knots, now faced aircraft diving at 300 knots. The Mark 37 Director could train at 10 degrees per second. A diving kamikaze could cross its field of fire in moments. The mechanical computers that calculated firing solutions needed time to stabilize their tracks. Kamikazes did not give them time. From November 1944 through January 1945, kamikaze attacks sank 16 American ships and damaged 87 more. Casualties mounted into the thousands. The attacks were not stopping American advances, but they were exacting a terrible price. Something had to change. The engineers who had built radar fire control for surface combat now faced their greatest challenge. The problem was not detection. Radar could see incoming aircraft from over 100 miles away. The problem was engagement. Traditional anti-aircraft doctrine emphasized barrage fire, putting up a wall of shells that attacking aircraft had to fly through. But kamikazes did not fly level approaches through predictable zones. They dove from high altitude at steep angles, presenting small targets moving at extreme speeds. The 5-inch guns controlled by the Mark 37 system were too slow to track these diving attacks effectively. Their rate of fire, 15 rounds per minute, meant long intervals between shots. Their shells took seconds to reach altitude. By the time a salvo arrived at the predicted intercept point, the kamikaze had already moved hundreds of feet. 40mm Bofors guns were faster but shorter ranged. 20mm Oerlikon cannons were faster still, but lacked the punch to reliably destroy an incoming aircraft before it reached the ship. The solution required an entirely new approach. Instead of trying to hit a small, fast-moving target with aimed fire, what if you could make every shell explode at exactly the right moment? What if the shell itself could sense when it was close enough to the target and detonate automatically? This concept was called the proximity fuse, and it had been in development since 1940. The idea was elegant. A tiny radar transmitter built into the artillery shell would emit a signal. When that signal bounced off a nearby object, a receiver in the same shell would detect the reflection. If the reflection was strong enough, indicating the shell was close to the target, the fuse would detonate the shell automatically. No direct hit required. A near miss became as deadly as a direct hit. The engineering challenges were immense. The fuse had to survive being fired from a gun experiencing forces of 20,000 times gravity during launch. It had to function reliably after storage in tropical heat or Arctic cold. It had to be cheap enough to mass produce, and it had to be small enough to fit inside a standard artillery shell. By 1944, American industry had solved these problems. The Mark 53 proximity fuse for 5-inch shells was entering mass production. Combined with the Mark 37 fire control system, it promised to transform anti-aircraft defense. But promises meant nothing until proven in combat. The proving ground came at Okinawa. The invasion of this island, just 340 miles from mainland Japan, began on April 1, 1945. American commanders knew the Japanese would throw everything they had at the invasion fleet. They were right. The Japanese called their response Operation Kikusui, meaning floating chrysanthemums. It was the largest coordinated kamikaze offensive of the war. 10 major attacks between April and June 1945 would send nearly 1,500 suicide aircraft against American ships. The first mass attack came on April 6th. Japanese commanders launched 355 kamikaze aircraft, along with hundreds of conventional attackers. The American fleet was anchored around Okinawa, supporting troops ashore. Destroyer picket stations formed a ring around the island, their radar watching for incoming threats. At 1,500 radar operators aboard the destroyer USS Bush detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. Range 60 miles. The Combat Information Center calculated intercept courses and vectored fighter patrols toward the threat. Hellcat and Corsair fighters tore into the Japanese formation, shooting down dozens of aircraft. But there were too many. The Japanese had learned to overwhelm fighter defenses through sheer numbers. Survivors broke through and headed for the picket line. USS Bush was one of the first ships attacked. A kamikaze dove on her from high altitude. The 5-inch guns opened fire using proximity-fused ammunition. The first salvo missed. The second salvo detonated close to the aircraft shrapnel, tearing into its engine and wing. The Zero began trailing smoke but kept coming. A third salvo exploded directly in its path. The aircraft disintegrated less than 500 yards from the ship, but more were coming. Within minutes, Bush was fighting for her life against multiple attackers. One kamikaze got through, crashing into the ship's superstructure. Fires broke out. Damage control parties fought the flames, while gunners continued firing at new threats. A second kamikaze struck. Then a third. Bush was destroyed, sinking with 94 of her crew. But for every kamikaze that reached its target, 3 or 4 were destroyed by proximity-fused shells. Ships that would have been overwhelmed using conventional ammunition survived because near misses now killed. The destroyer USS Lutze shot down 6 kamikazes in a single engagement using proximity fuses. USS Newcomb destroyed 4 before finally being hit by a 5th. Across the fleet, the pattern repeated. Losses were heavy, but they were far lighter than they would have been without the proximity fuse. The statistics told the story. Before proximity fuses, anti-aircraft guns required an average of over 2,000 rounds to bring down one aircraft using conventional time-fused ammunition. With proximity fuses, the average dropped to fewer than 500 rounds. Some ships reported kill rates 4 times better than their previous performance. The improvement was not incremental. It was revolutionary. The Japanese noticed immediately. Intelligence officers analyzing wreckage recovered from crashed kamikazes found something strange. Aircraft were being destroyed without direct hits. Shrapnel patterns indicated shells exploding nearby, rather than striking the aircraft itself. Japanese engineers examined the fragments and reached a disturbing conclusion. American shells were somehow sensing the presence of aircraft and detonating automatically. This seemed impossible. Fitting a radar system into an artillery shell was beyond anything Japanese industry could achieve. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Japanese commanders adjusted their tactics. They ordered pilots to approach at extreme low altitude, hoping to confuse the mysterious American fuses with radar reflections from the ocean surface. They sent aircraft in waves, hoping to exhaust American ammunition supplies. They launched attacks at dawn and dusk when lighting conditions made visual tracking difficult. None of these adjustments changed the fundamental equation. American ships equipped with proximity fuses and radar fire control were simply harder to kill. A kamikaze that would have succeeded in 1944 was being destroyed in 1945. The calculus of suicide attack was shifting. Japan was running out of pilots faster than America was running out of ships. The impact extended beyond individual engagements. Carrier task forces could now operate closer to Japanese home islands, confident in their ability to defend against mass air attacks. Battleships and cruisers providing fire support at Okinawa survived attacks that would have destroyed them months earlier. The invasion proceeded on schedule despite the most intense air opposition of the Pacific War. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, Japanese kamikazes had sunk 36 American ships and damaged 368 others. The casualties were terrible. Nearly 5,000 American sailors died. But the invasion succeeded. The island was secured, and American losses, while heavy, were a fraction of what they would have been without radar fire control and proximity fuses working together. The broader implications changed how both sides planned for the future. American commanders studying the Okinawa statistics reached a profound conclusion. The invasion of Japan's home islands, scheduled for November 1945, would face kamikaze attacks on an unprecedented scale. Japanese forces were hoarding aircraft and training pilots specifically for this final defense. Estimates suggested 10,000 or more suicide aircraft would be thrown against the invasion fleet. But the same statistics showed that American defenses were improving faster than Japanese attacks. New ships entering the fleet carried more advanced radar systems and larger supplies of proximity fused ammunition. Fire control computers were being upgraded with better tracking algorithms. Training programs were producing more skilled operators. The ratio of kamikazes destroyed to ships sunk was steadily improving. For Japanese planners, the message was equally clear. The kamikaze strategy that had seemed so promising in late 1944 was failing. Each successive attack achieved less than the one before. American technology was adapting faster than Japanese tactics could evolve. The divine wind was not blowing hard enough to stop the American advance. This realization contributed to debates within the Japanese government about continuing the war. Hardliners argued that mass suicide attacks during the invasion would inflict casualties so severe that Americans would negotiate peace. Moderates pointed to the Okinawa statistics and questioned whether suicide attacks could achieve anything beyond prolonging suffering. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended these debates before they were resolved. But the technological trajectory was already clear. American defensive capabilities were improving with each passing month, while Japanese offensive capabilities were declining. Time favored the defenders. The men who created these systems received little public recognition during the war. Radar and proximity fuse technology were among the most closely guarded secrets of the conflict. Sailors were forbidden from discussing the capabilities of their fire control systems. Engineers who designed the proximity fuse worked in classified facilities and could not speak of their achievements. Even after the war, the full story took decades to emerge. Hannibal Ford, whose mechanical computers formed the heart of American fire control, continued working in relative obscurity. His Ford Instrument Company produced navigation and fire control equipment for the Navy until 1963, when it was absorbed into the Sperry Corporation. Ford himself rarely spoke publicly about his contributions. The proximity fuse was eventually recognized as one of the three most significant technological developments of the war, alongside radar itself and the atomic bomb. Winston Churchill called it one of the most remarkable scientific achievements of the conflict. Yet the names of the engineers who made it possible remained largely unknown to the public. The sailors who operated these systems knew their value. Veterans of the kamikaze battles spoke for decades about the moment when a diving aircraft disintegrated in midair, destroyed by a shell that seemed to know exactly when to explode. They understood that their survival depended on technologies they could not see and engineers they would never meet. But the full story of radar fire control involves more than battles won and enemies defeated. It involves what happened after the war, when the same technologies that saved ships at Okinawa began reshaping the entire world. In Part 4, we will explore the legacy that outlasted the conflict itself. We will discover how fire control computers evolved into something far more significant than anyone imagined in 1945. We will learn what happened to the men who created these systems and how their work influenced technologies we use every day. The war ended in August 1945. But the revolution that began with a radar set and a mechanical computer was only getting started. And the most surprising chapter of this story is the one almost nobody knows. We began this story with an impossible shot. 700 yards. Shells falling from beyond the horizon onto a Japanese destroyer whose crew never saw the battleship that fired at them. We watched as radar fire control transformed from a skeptic's joke into a battle-winning technology at Surigao Strait. We witnessed the desperate kamikaze attacks at Okinawa, where proximity fuses and mechanical computers saved thousands of American lives. From an engineer's workshop in Long Island City to the burning waters of the Pacific, this technology changed everything about naval warfare. But every story of innovation has a chapter that history books rarely tell. What happened to the men who made the impossible possible? What became of the machines they built? And why does this story from 1944 still matter today in an age of satellites and guided missiles and artificial intelligence? The answers reveal something unexpected. Because the greatest legacy of radar fire control was not the battles it won or the lives it saved during World War II. The greatest legacy was something nobody predicted, something that would reshape human civilization itself. And it started with a quiet engineer who never sought fame, never wrote memoirs, and died before the world understood what he had truly created. Hannibal Choate Ford was born in 1877 in Dryden, New York, a small town that barely appears on most maps. His father was a farmer. His mother taught school. Nothing in his early life suggested he would become one of the most important engineers of the 20th century. Ford showed an aptitude for mathematics and mechanics from an early age. He attended Cornell University, graduating with a degree in mechanical engineering in 1903. His first job was with the Submarine Signal Company in Boston, working on underwater sound detection systems. It was unglamorous work, but it taught him to think about problems that seemed impossible. How do you detect something you cannot see? How do you measure something that exists only as vibrations in water? These questions would define his career. In 1915, Ford founded his own company, Ford Instrument Company, in a small factory in Long Island City. He had one product in mind: mechanical computers that could solve complex mathematical problems automatically. His timing was perfect. The United States Navy was struggling with fire control for its new dreadnought battleships. The guns could shoot farther than ever before, but hitting a moving target at extreme range required calculations too complex and too time-sensitive for human computers to perform. Ford built machines that could do what humans could not. His Mark I fire control computer, completed in 1917, used gears and cams and rotating drums to solve the differential equations of naval gunnery in real time. It was crude by later standards, but it worked. The Navy ordered more. Ford spent the next 2 decades refining his designs, each generation more sophisticated than the last. By 1939, his company employed over 3,000 workers and produced the most advanced fire control systems in the world. Yet Ford himself remained virtually unknown outside naval engineering circles. He gave no interviews. He wrote no popular articles. He attended no ceremonies. When reporters occasionally asked about his work, he deflected attention to his team. The machines were what mattered, not the man who designed them. During World War II, Ford Instrument Company produced over 10,000 fire control computers for the Navy. The Mark 37 system that devastated Japanese forces from Surigao Strait to Okinawa was his design. The mechanical calculators that made radar fire control possible came from his factory. Yet when the war ended, Ford received no medal, no presidential commendation, no public recognition. He continued working quietly until 1955, when failing health forced him to retire. He died in 1965 at the age of 87. His obituary in the New York Times was brief, mentioning only that he had been an engineer who worked on naval fire control systems. It did not mention that his machines had helped win the largest naval war in history. It did not mention that his approach to mechanical computation had influenced an entirely new field of technology. But the legacy Hannibal Ford left behind was far greater than any medal could represent. The fire control computers Ford designed were analog machines. They used mechanical components, gears and cams and rotating shafts to represent mathematical values. A turning gear might represent target bearing. A cam might convert that bearing into a firing angle. The machines were ingenious, but they had fundamental limitations. They could only solve problems they were specifically designed to solve. Changing the calculation meant redesigning the machine. During the war, a different approach was emerging. Electronic computers using vacuum tubes instead of gears could be programmed to solve different problems without physical modification. The first general-purpose electronic computer, ENIAC, was completed in 1945. It was designed to calculate artillery firing tables, the same type of problem Ford's machines had been solving mechanically for decades. The engineers who built ENIAC had studied Ford's fire control computers. They understood the principles of automatic computation that Ford had pioneered. They simply implemented those principles using electronics instead of mechanics. The connection was direct and acknowledged. John Moshley, one of ENIAC's creators, specifically cited naval fire control systems as inspiration for his work on electronic computation. The idea that a machine could automatically solve complex mathematical problems in real time came directly from the fire control computers of World War II. This lineage continued through subsequent generations of computing technology. The transistor replaced the vacuum tube. The integrated circuit replaced discrete components. But the fundamental concept remained unchanged. A machine that could accept data inputs, process them according to programmed instructions, and produce outputs faster than any human could calculate. Hannibal Ford did not invent the electronic computer, but he proved that automatic computation was possible and practical. He demonstrated that machines could solve problems too complex for human minds working in real time. He created the conceptual framework that electronic pioneers would later implement in silicon and software. Today, the device you are using to watch this video contains more computing power than every fire control computer built during World War II combined. The smartphone in your pocket can perform calculations that would have taken Ford's machines hours to complete. Yet the basic architecture inputs processed through computational logic to produce outputs traces directly back to the fire control systems of the 1940s. The proximity fuse followed a similar trajectory. The technology developed to detonate artillery shells near aircraft became the foundation for countless sensor systems. Automatic doors that open when you approach. Collision avoidance systems in automobiles. Industrial safety systems that stop machines when humans get too close. The principle is identical. Detect an object through radio waves, measure its proximity, trigger an action when it reaches a threshold distance. American and British engineers estimated that the proximity fuse saved thousands of lives during World War II. But the civilian applications that followed have saved millions more. Every car with automatic emergency braking uses principles derived from proximity fuse technology. Every aircraft with terrain avoidance radar owes something to the engineers who figured out how to make a shell smart enough to know when to explode. The deeper lesson of this story is not about technology. It is about how institutions respond to innovation. The radar fire control systems that proved so decisive in combat faced years of skepticism and resistance before they were adopted. Senior officers who had built their careers on optical fire control viewed radar with suspicion. They raised objections that seemed reasonable at the time. Radar was untested. Radar was unreliable. Radar could not possibly match the precision of trained human operators with optical instruments. These objections were not stupid. They were based on experience and evidence. Early radar systems were unreliable. They did struggle with precision. The skeptics were not wrong about the technology as it existed. They were wrong about the technology as it would become. This pattern repeats throughout military history and beyond. The machine gun was dismissed by cavalry officers who believed the shock of a mounted charge would always defeat infantry. The aircraft carrier was dismissed by battleship admirals who believed big guns would always dominate naval warfare. The tank was dismissed by generals who believed that trenches and artillery made mobile warfare impossible. In each case, the skeptics had evidence on their side. Early machine guns jammed frequently. Early aircraft carriers were vulnerable, and their planes were fragile. Early tanks broke down constantly and were easily destroyed by artillery. The skeptics were right about the present. They were wrong about the future. The men who changed history were those who could see beyond current limitations to future potential. Hannibal Ford looked at primitive radar sets that could barely detect a ship at a few miles and saw a future where radar would track targets beyond the horizon with pinpoint accuracy. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf looked at sailors who struggled to interpret radar screens and saw a future where crews trained to trust their instruments would destroy enemies they never saw. These men did not predict the future through magic or genius. They predicted it through imagination, guided by technical understanding. They knew what radar could become because they understood the principles that made it work. They knew that engineering problems could be solved because they had spent their careers solving engineering problems. This same pattern continues today. Artificial intelligence faces skeptics who point to current limitations. Autonomous vehicles face critics who catalog their failures. New military technologies face generals who trust proven systems over promising ones. Some of this skepticism is healthy. Not every new technology fulfills its promise. Many innovations fail. But the lesson of radar fire control is that transformative technologies often look inadequate before they become dominant. The question is not whether a technology works perfectly today. The question is whether its fundamental principles allow it to work better tomorrow. There is one final detail of this story that almost nobody knows. In 1944, as American ships were using radar fire control to devastate Japanese forces across the Pacific, Japanese naval intelligence launched a desperate effort to understand how Americans were achieving such impossible accuracy. They recovered fragments from proximity fuse shells. They interrogated prisoners. They analyzed wreckage from every engagement where American gunnery seemed superhuman. The Japanese concluded that Americans must be using some form of radio detection and ranging to direct their fire, but they could not understand how radio waves could provide the precision necessary for accurate gunnery. Their own experiments with radar had produced disappointing results. The equipment was unreliable. The readings were imprecise. Japanese engineers concluded that American radar must be fundamentally different from their own built on principles they did not understand. They were right. But the principles were not mysterious. They were the result of years of development, thousands of engineers, billions of dollars in investment, and an industrial base capable of producing precision electronics in massive quantities. Japan could not replicate American radar, not because the technology was secret, but because the infrastructure to build it did not exist in Japan. After the war, American occupation forces discovered something remarkable in Japanese naval archives. In early 1945, Japanese engineers had actually designed a radar fire control system similar to American systems. They understood the principles. They had drawn the blueprints, but they could not build it. Japanese industry, devastated by bombing and starved of raw materials, could not produce the precision components required. The knowledge existed. The capability did not. This discovery revealed the true nature of American victory. It was not just about having better ideas. It was about having the industrial capacity to turn ideas into reality at scale. Japan had brilliant engineers. Japan had dedicated sailors. Japan had centuries of military tradition. None of it mattered against an opponent who could outproduce them in every category of military technology. The same shells that fell on Milwaukee in February 1944 represented something larger than radar or fire control. They represented the cumulative output of American mines, American steel mills, American electronics factories, American universities, American research laboratories, and American workers. Each 16-inch shell contained raw materials from multiple continents, processed through dozens of industrial steps, assembled by workers trained in skills that took years to develop. The radar that guided those shells required vacuum tubes manufactured to tolerances, measured in thousandths of an inch, by workers using machinery that itself required precision manufacturing to build. The fire control computers required gears cut with accuracy that only the most advanced machine tools could achieve. This was not a war won by brave individuals. Though brave individuals contributed, it was a war won by systems, by institutions, by the accumulated capability of an industrial civilization operating at full capacity. The shells that fell from beyond the horizon were not miracles. They were products. From a farmer's son in upstate New York with an obsession for mechanical calculation, to a technology that helped win the largest war in human history, to the digital revolution that transformed human civilization. Hannibal Ford never saw a smartphone. He never used the internet. He never knew that the principles he developed for aiming naval guns would eventually enable machines that could recognize faces, translate languages, and navigate cars through city streets. He died believing he had simply built better fire control systems. The full scope of what he started was beyond anything he imagined. The numbers tell part of the story. Over 10,000 fire control computers built during World War II. Hundreds of thousands of proximity fuses produced. Dozens of major naval engagements where radar fire control proved decisive. Thousands of American lives saved by technology that the enemy could not match or understand. But numbers cannot capture everything. They cannot capture the moment when a sailor at Okinawa watched a kamikaze disintegrate in midair, destroyed by a shell that seemed to know exactly when to explode. They cannot capture the relief of men who survived battles that should have killed them. They cannot capture the quiet pride of engineers who knew their work mattered even if the world never learned their names. The next time you ask a computer to solve a problem, the next time your phone calculates a route through traffic, the next time a sensor detects your presence and opens a door, remember that these capabilities have origins. They did not appear from nowhere. They were built by people who saw possibilities that others dismissed as impossible. Some of those people wore uniforms. Some wore lab coats. Some wore the work clothes of factory engineers in Long Island City. Most of them are forgotten now. But what they built endures. We live in a world shaped by their imagination, their persistence, and their refusal to accept that what seemed impossible must remain impossible. That is the true legacy of radar fire control. Not the battles won, not the lives saved, but the proof that human beings can solve problems that seem beyond solution if they have the courage to try and the patience to persist. If you know other stories like this, stories of innovations dismissed as crazy until they changed the world, share them in the comments. History is full of moments when someone saw further than everyone around them and the world changed because they refused to give up. This is just one of hundreds of such stories from World War II alone. Subscribe to discover more of them. And remember the lesson that echoes from that morning in February 1944, when shells fell from beyond the horizon onto a ship whose crew never saw death coming. The future belongs not to those who can see farthest with their eyes, but to those who can see farthest with their imagination.